Well, hi, Max. Welcome to the show. Everybody, you guys know Max Ajl. Max Ajl, as I've admitted before, is the secret man behind the plan of the show for its entire history, basically. He's provided hundreds of guests. So we're here with the mastermind, the shadow commander of the East is a podcast, Max Ajl. Hi, Max.
Good morning, Sina. Happy to join you from the land of imperialism.
Yeah, we all live in the land of imperialism in one way or another, and maybe that's the topic of our conversation. So the original purpose of this conversation was to kind of sit and reflect on, basically the events of sort of June 2025. It was in a remarkable month. Obviously the Iran-Israel war is the centerpiece of that, but like a lot of history unfolded in this time, and I think in our societies, in our neoliberal society, where like this kind of media class that is held over us, just is this most vapid, useless class that the serious conversations that we don't have, like podcasts and informal conversations, like at intellectual level, universities, wherever, at the official places you assume them to be, that's because they don't happen there, and quite to the contrary, like a lot of counterproductive things happen. So it falls to us, I think, to like host these kinds of conversations, informal as though they are. But I'm trying in some ways, as we get further and further on from, or like it's farther in our rear view, so to speak. It's been 2 months now since it happened. It still feels like a sort of strange fever dream to me. I recorded a few episodes during it, which I half regret, because I don't know, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Who cares? I think, but overall though, and I was thinking this as I was reading your piece, is that, oh, sorry, I lost one of my earbuds. It's that the simple matter in the Iran, like when we're talking about Iran, and some basic things go out the window. And this piece that you wrote, I have it right here, Peoples and Regimes, Anti-Imperialism in the Islamic Republic, published July 4th, America Day itself. I was thinking about something you say. It's very simple. Indeed, I like this phrase. Indeed, the U.S. propaganda machine claims that to always target, quote, the regime and not the people. Civilian casualties are dismissed as collateral damage. Hospitals are hit by, quote, errant strikes. Infrastructural damage is regrettable, but is the result of misfires or, quote, government run. Casualty counts are deliberately manipulated using dizzyingly creative accounting techniques that turn civilians, armed men over 16, into soldiers. So that, like, in some ways, I found your piece to be just like refreshing in a sense that, like, yeah, it's really basic. That, like, Iran is a victim of U.S. imperialism for 5 decades. Simple as that. It's one of its main targets, in fact. And one of the reason for that is simple, is that it has achieved sovereignty. And that sovereignty is what Iran and the state attached to it, its people, the articulation of that people's sovereignty, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, is that is its main bulwark of that sovereignty. And so you attack that bulwark, you attack that state, you delegitimize it, discursively, militarily, economically, and then you, with the hope of degrading it such that it triggers rival internal forces or internal contradictions, whatever, right? And so the sort of opening salvo of all this is to say is that, I've really rethought the consequences of that war and what actually occurred. I was thinking about how, as spectacular, and I mean that in the literal sense of like spectacle, is that as spectacular as the Zionist assault was, surprise attack, or could basically a kind of Pearl Harbor attack, to speak in Westoid terms, that the consequences of this are really quite something else. And it also announced a new kind of warfare, right? Which was kind of this tele-remote, or sort of whatever we want to call it, right? Which was linked together this invisible network of sabotage and saboteurs through the internet, either in place static assets or, just kind of things left behind, or active people, agents, combination of the two and whatever. And so many things happened in this. And of course, our media class completely failed. No one's talked about it. It's been memory hold the wall, even among our own people. So I guess at the outset, I'm curious to think, 2 months on, what is your assessment of what happened? And in the most general way, do you think the imperialists achieved their goals in it?
Because it isn't a regime, in fact, and because it is a relatively open society, comparatively speaking, they are unable to keep an iron grip on everything that happens there, right? And Iran took a hard hit. It took a hard hit. The command and control structure endured. The state structure endured. All the military command and control structures, even though large portions of them were decapitated at the very top, they're like a hydra. They grew new heads because they're institutionalized, right? They're capable. They have backup leadership. And because they are actually reflections of a regime in its very nature that is longue durée, historical, institutionalized in Iran. They brought up the new leadership. They figured out how they were going to counterattack, and then they carried out a counterattack, essentially, that was sufficiently hard to make the Zionists tell America to broker a peace deal, right? Which we could call the Zionists controlling America if we were on this type of brainless cogitation. So this is the overall perspective of what happened, right? In terms of so obviously neither the Zionists nor the Americans really achieved their goals in this very limited war, right? It was a very limited war. It was almost a battle. Now, I think that the people who were like, Iran is incapable of fighting back, blah blah blah. It's like we can't really take them seriously. They would be discredited. But people who are mouthpieces for imperialism, whether by effect or intent, are actually never really discredited, right? Because they're held up. Because they're regurgitating in whatever form the dominant ideology that is useful for all the other people who also are on imperialist ideology, right? That's one thing. But another thing that is really striking, not only about Iran, but that we saw in the course of the Syrian war until the regime change actually hit its goals, but that we saw from 2011, and that we see in the discussion around Hezbollah, and that we see in the discussion around Gaza, is that there is a failure, I think, in the anti-imperialist camp, the correct term, right? To understand that you lose battles in a war, and you lose set pieces in a battle, right? You don't. This is not like a Captain America thing where you go from win to win to win to win to win to win to win. Like, that's not how things work. Like, the enemy is planning proactively, reacting to the situation. The enemy has the best mercenaries who are willing to sell their souls or make profit from military planning on its behalf. Still has a large technological advantage, has an infrastructural advantage because they have several regimes. They have a great many regimes on their side, and they win. They take smaller or larger wins in the battle. So they were very effective, and we know it, in disorganizing the capacity for an Iranian counter. Like, that was their plan, and they did it with a decent degree of success, right? They didn't eliminate it at all, the capacity for the Iranian counter, but they did disorganize it, right? And that was their goal in that attack, to do a large disorganization of the Iranian capacity to, the above ground missile launchers. Many of them were hammered very hard, right? We know that.
But I don't know. I don't know how many. That's the thing. We don't know actually how many, because I've seen Iranian OSINT bros, mind you, who doubted a lot of the sort of crowing of the sort of the attack on of these launchers, because there's also like Iran has a lot of launchers, and so finding them, especially because of the nature of the Zionist attack, because partly is that these kind of surface to surface missiles that they had planted, right, that don't do a ton of damage on their own, but when locked in the right spot, can effectively work to do that. Now, here's my question, though. This is what it doesn't make sense to me. So when you plan this kind of attack, it better work, or like you better get the entire capacity of your enemy to not be able to strike back, because your enemy can still strike back. So there's either one of two scenarios. One, they knew that they couldn't achieve the globality of their success that they need to stay untouched or unharmed, which is the entire Zionist war doctrine, because ultimately they're fucking cowards and they're too afraid to actually fight real fights. So they do all this like crazy sort of like tele-distance fighting. But then on top of that is that then, or either they planned on that, or they didn't plan on that. They didn't plan on an Iranian counterattack. And this is what counseled them to end their war, and without achieving what they wanted, because on its face, it doesn't make sense. Why would you do this? You're trading away your like billions in dollars of damage, which is what the Iranian counter responses over the course of the war achieved. Even until its last days, Iran was still hitting, and this is with the help of the entirety of the West and the Arab vassal regimes who host more weapons, who don't have their own air forces. I have to state this, who don't have their own. They just host British and American ones, and coordinate with this and help, and basically are like the fig leaf of sovereignty that, you know, is mapped onto this like basically defense network around this one country. So despite that, with the entire machine working to defend this stupid ethno-state, they still got hammered hard, such that their censorship regime, you know, has been working in overdrive.
Right. I mean, Sina, I think it's also possible that they were counseled that the more prostrate actors within the Iranian government would be counseling restraint, and that they misinterpreted some of the earlier Iranian restraint, and they said, okay, you know, because the deterrence is both psychological and kind of military and political all at the same time, right? Obviously, both forces have a great destructive capacity. They know that. Their intelligence has it. Both sides' intelligence actually has it, that each side has a massive destructive capacity in terms of sheer military physical delivery vehicles. What are the costs of using it, and how do people understand those costs, right? You know, so over the past period, right, really since...
Okay, so you're saying it's scenario one, that like they didn't plan on having this response. I think it was scenario one. Yeah.
They war room all of these scenarios, right? They run through, this is what they do. You know, we make fun of them, but this is what they do. They war game a variety of scenarios, right?
It's their religion. War is their religion. I don't think we should.
Right, but no, every military force is with sufficient institutional capacity is like wargaming scenarios, right? I mean, they're pretending to run the war. I mean, this is what they're taught in the military schools, right? The Iranians also. So this is what I mean. I don't mean that. So what I mean is that they probably knew that they judged that it was more advantageous to take the risk of a reply, and like maybe they judged it to be a lower risk, or maybe whoever had Netanyahu's ear convinced Netanyahu, right? Even if because we see all this dissent constantly within the Israeli military brass, right? They're like, this isn't going to work, what you're planning. We don't have the resources for it. And Netanyahu's like, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway, right? Damn the cost, right? In terms of what's happening in Gaza itself. So where there's direct troop ground forces who are losing, right? The hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, right, of injured and killed from the IOF forces. So it's also very plausible that someone had Netanyahu's ear, who was like, this is a low probability operation. The Iranians are scared. Look at how they've been reacting and so forth. And that's what happened also. So basically scenario one, they knew they couldn't sufficiently hit Iran's capacities, but they felt that they could hit Iran with sufficient force, which also, I'll get to that, right? They felt that they could hit Iran with sufficient force such that Iran would be content with some form of show of force in reply, but would basically husband its resources. That's one. Two, they hit Iran less hard than they planned to, right? They hit Iran if we, not
air defenses weren't supposed to work as well as they ended up working, I think. That's definitely, I think, yeah.
Well, the air defenses, they were hitting a lot of empty installations, right? They were hitting a lot of mock-up installations. They were hitting a lot of old installations. We don't know because both sides keep radio silence effectively, to some extent anyway, as much as possible, on the military and civilian damages that resulted from the war itself, right? But at the same time, we have to assume also that the Zionists degraded less than they expected to degrade. Now, I don't mean less than they wanted to degrade, because they wanted to degrade an awful lot, but they degraded less probably than they expected to degrade, because even in the nature of a partially successful set piece attack, right, you take internal losses within the attack itself, right? So the attack itself is not like one attack. It's like many different components, and some of them aren't working as well, which is the nature of the Iranian deterrence. Didn't fail fully, right? Or the Iranian defense mechanisms. They didn't fail fully, right? I mean, within 24 hours, the command and control was able to reconstitute, for one thing. For another, if the Zionists hit a sufficiently large number of basically empty installations, then it's clear that the Iranians were more successful than the Zionists anticipated in kind of diverting Zionist military attack into hitting these Potemkin village military installations, right? And so this is what I mean that.
So this is the question. Now we're back to that original scenario. Is that so? In the midst of all this, I think your response to, like, I forget which scenario was which, but basically they planned it in this way and it worked out for them, or they didn't plan it in this way and it didn't work out for them. Because
I think they had a plan, and it was less successful, both in terms of the plan itself that they anticipated, but also it was less successful vis-a-vis both internal to the kind of military of the plan and in terms of the goals. I mean, I don't think they planned for such a hard hit back, like, very simply.
Yes. Because then you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. That would be crazy to take that kind of blow from an enemy, especially when your society is built on racial supremacy. Okay? You are supposed to be better than your enemies. You are not supposed to take the kinds of things that your enemies do that you do to the enemies. So that's why October 7th was so traumatizing to them, because they realized, despite everything, despite all of their command and control, despite all of their technological superiority, that, like, some people from Gaza, some starved residents of Gaza, got together and broke that security barrier and shocked them and took away that equanimity. So to flip that on the case is that they took that. So the stress that the Gaza resistance was able to, like, induce upon the border regions of the entity, right? So, like, the so-called Gaza envelope, those southern cities, not that they're cities, right? We're talking about fucking colonial outposts here, but whatever. But, like, ultimately, Iran, I think the consequences of this, it was that Iran hitting where they hit and hitting as hard as they did, despite all of the boost of the West, that is a huge blow that can't be measured to their security. Because what we're also not mentioning here is the degree of difficulty. Eradicating the Zionist entity has difficulty, sure, but Iran is a much bigger country than than Iran, than Israel, right? It's a very big country. Iran is a huge country. Its resources are spread out, and Israel is two cities protected by a web of military installations. So, like, if you're looking at these two places, these are apples and oranges.
I mean, this is like what yeah, I mean, either Ibrahim Alamin or Amar Mohsen was pointing this out that, in fact, because of the technology that's now been elevated and escalated on both sides, there's, in a sense, the territorial aspect shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, right? On the one hand, on the Israeli side, it's in its very nature that that it doesn't have a lot of territorial strategic depth, which actually matters in warfare, right? Actually, that's the first basis of this geographical, we're not like Alfred Mayer or whatever, this British lunatic naval dude, but like the geopolitics of it, the geophysical politics of it, obviously matter. Like when we talk about with the advantages the Zionists now have in terms of having the highest listening post in Zionist occupied Syria, for example. And this gives them a lot more access to intercept radio and signal traffic from all over the Levant, including, of course, Lebanon, right? Because they have these heights now, and their radars could only partially penetrate, right? This is also why they deploy their anti-aircraft assets in Jordan, for example, right? Because they want to take this stuff out before it enters over the so-called the Zionist skies, right? Or into the Zionist airspace itself, right? They need to expand their envelope, and it's expanded geopolitically through allies, or it's expanded through war. But this is the basis of, this is the determining condition within which all the institutional decisions and structures can unfold, is basically geography, right? And on the flip side, the Zionists, and we know that, of course, that you can be sure they're consorting with the US and NATO, which is also consorting with Ukraine, right? They're trying to close that frontier by activating assets internal to the enemy geography so that the border becomes less relevant, right? And that's what they did with the drones that came out and attacked the Russian planes. I mean, probably they didn't attack that many of them. That was wildly overstated. But, they did a lot of attack on the Russian planes, on those military bases, right? And some of those things were probably also deployed in Iran, right? So basically what they're doing is they're trying to carve away at the Iranian geography by saying, okay, you might have a border, but it's porous. And so we can bring our assets in and attack from within, and therefore try to eliminate some of your geographical advantage. Now, that can only be partial, right? I mean, what most people have been saying, as far as I know, is that they were using a lot of standoff munitions and standoff attacks because they really they had minimal ability of their planes to enter most of the Iranian airspace. Like, they didn't carry out nearly as much attrition on the air defense as they thought they did, or as they announced, because they knew what had happened and they didn't send planes in, right? So, but I think overall, right, and this is something that has to be thought about, is that the kind of the internet addiction of people actually prevents us from like taking a step back and understanding that you take hits in war, right? Your side takes, and because people have watched video games, you take very hard hits in a war. Like, I remember they were like the volcano of Damascus or something in 2012, right? Or 2011. And, you saw the Syrian regime apologists being like, our forces are 7 seconds from taking over the palace in Damascus. And it was like, okay, well, they were actually like, cantoned in like a suburb, surrounded by Syrian military forces. I mean, when the Syrian military broke, that was a different story, right? Which we won't go into today because that's a whole nother topic. But, there's a huge psyop, and people have taken that as their actual framework for understanding reality, right? I mean, what's happening in Gaza is beyond catastrophic, right? And if I understand correctly, there may now be certain calls. This is probably why Hamas accepted this, partially why Hamas accepted the most recent proposal, which was a retreat from its earlier calls for the only proposal they would accept is a proposal to end the war, right? Because there is a great fear you see it with people talking about the fact that the loss of Gaza City itself would be catastrophic, right? And there's a pressure to arrive at something, and this is what pushed Hamas to arrive partially at accepting provisionally this type of agreement. But anyway, that was a partial tangent. But what I wanted to say is that at the same time as that happened, right, Hamas carried out one of its most complicated ambushes, I think today or maybe yesterday, I didn't get the timestamp on it, of the entire war, right? And it's been continuing to do that because whatever one wants to say about the broader military strategy and whatever we should say about the humanitarian cost of it, which no one could have expected, the war is actually continuing between the Zionists and the Palestinians on the ground. That war is continuing, and the attrition of the Israeli regime military is continuing, and that's in the nature of a guerrilla, an asymmetric insurgency war, and its counterinsurgency, that you need to grind up the capacity of your enemy to hurt you, right? That's objectively, that is happening, but the costs are indescribable, right? And a lot of this is lost in when there's the fixation on this idea that a battle moves from win to win to win, sort of like what happened in 2006 in Lebanon. But that was just a total breakdown of Zionist intelligence, probably, and they learned their lesson from that, and that's okay. That's how these things happen.
I guess in the case of Iran, the Iran stuff is like, this is a moment to reflect upon how, I guess, what the shape and character of anti-imperialism is. And it doesn't necessarily take the figure of something you recognize as, because we have this like Platonic ideal as we have these Platonic ideals that we read about in books about liberation, and also that we also letter, like, not just like fictional books, but like, other characters from other histories. You read about them and you tend, and because we are readers and we are sort of imaginative people, we tend to construct other ideals, and that's how we imagine scenarios playing out, that countries look like this and they're led by people who look like this and they say this kind of stuff, and liberatory countries, that is, good countries, not anti-imperialist countries. But I guess in the case of the Iran, one thing, and this is something that I've grappled with, is that, yeah, you have to, like, warts and all, is that there's elements of the system of the Islamic Republic that have failed the Iranian people. And that's without question, right? That's without saying that it has failed in a number of ways. And I'm not like, that's not some denunciation. That's just a statement of fact. But then the first thing you have to say to all that is that no matter whatever in that moment I felt, and I feel that this is the true loss of the imperialists, is that they hoped, I get the impression that they believed their own regime change bullshit about Iran, that they listened to the liberal and reactionary forces, diaspora forces, who whisper in their ears, these fucking Iagos. Looks like I have one eye. It's very funny. Sorry, I'm very ADD today. It's just like these fucking Iagos who whisper in their ears that, oh, the regime is dead, the regime is dead. You just need to push it over a little bit more. And you wonder if they actually believe that stuff, and such that they thought that, killing a bunch of people at Evin prison would trigger some kind of like Bastille Day. Like, did they really, are Zionist imperialists that stupid? Do they think, I really do think they think Iranians are that stupid, that they would have triggered some kind of mass revolt that has been promised to them by their media assets. Because I still can't figure it out. Oh, I know why this light is on. All right, sorry. I'm being very ADD. Like, I can't figure it out. Like, it doesn't, you know what I mean? So like, because nothing they did achieved what they wanted it to. And so it makes you wonder, like what did they want it, like what was, and even in what they wanted to achieving wouldn't have occurred, it wouldn't result in what they wanted, in what the ultimate goal is, which is state collapse. And so I guess where I'm going with this is that like the warts and all aspect of the Islamic Republic came out, but then the things that it accomplished also came out. And so now the liberal regime changer has this problem of, oh, you, especially this, like, I'm conjecturing one. We all know these kind of characters. They're typically pro-Palestine, supposedly, but, you know, like anti-Islamic Republic because it's a bad regime. And then, which the story in Libya and Syria and all these other countries we know is that, oh, that third figure where it's neither Washington nor Tehran or whatever, that third place they imagine is completely fictional utopian. That the government that is not an imperialist vassal government and not the hated regime exists somewhere out there. You just have to anoint them with enough Western weaponry as possible. And this is what your article really brings out.
Sina, that's definitely true. And I would even take a step back and consider that, like, in the post-Soviet period, you know, the Western left in general, I mean, it's shifted now in the last 5 years, but the broadest terms, like the Western left and Western academia, basically said the national question is dead, right? That this question of taking state power is dead. Then you had this, and basically everything flowed from that in the nationalist left is dead. This idea of building socialism by taking state power is dead. There is no more national question, right? The remaining forces that want to take state power, we're not going to pay attention to them, or they're being outlawed by the terrorists like FARC and MPA in the Philippines, and so forth, right? And of course, the Palestinians who obviously have a national question, right? But there was an illegalization of their political forces. So at the theoretical level, right, and you have like people talking about, you know, at the older period, you had people denouncing state power and developmentalism. The new kind of mutation is kind of this babble about the coloniality of the state and so forth, right? And it takes various forms. And so very, you know, it's ultimately very, very vacuous, but what it really is an intellectual and theoretical assault on the post-war political sovereignty, post-World War II, basically political sovereignty regime that was a victory of the national liberation movements, and that was a consensus between the leading theorists of the anti-colonial struggle that you needed to take state power. No one questioned that, right? When Nkrumah was writing about neocolonialism, it was taken as a given that you needed to defeat colonialism and push the colonial power out of your country, and to take the reins of state power. And then, okay, all sorts of problems ensued with the building of developmentalism or socialism and so forth, right? But that was always a critique imminent and internal to the national liberation movements, right? It was a given that the state was a good thing. Everyone understood that, obviously, because they understood what happened when you didn't have the state. They had lived under it, right? So that itself is being rolled back. And then you have a subsequent political criminalization, economic attack, or economic embargo on the state. I mean, what are sanctions? Sanctions say that the economic functions of basically the state as a coordinator of the economy and also the associated enterprises under the state, they're illegal, right? They don't have access to this kind of much touted regime of free trade, right? Or of capitalist trade. They are actually illegal. What, you know, when they sanction the IGRC, or they sanctioning people from the Syrian government, they're criminalizing the very existence of the state itself, right? That's actually being criminalized. And of course, the terror lists are a criminalization of anyone who can use the state to their own, to ends that the US deems unacceptable, right? So you have the kind of the death of the theory and practice of the state.
The Syria model. That's the Syria model.
It's the Syria model, right? And it's not just the Syria model, right? It's also the Zimbabwe model, right? Which is also super important to keep in mind. I mean, the state power was used to assist a more bottom-up white to black agrarian reform.
Actually existing decolonization, by the way, that is vilified over here.
Actually existing land back, and this is aggressively demonized, right? So, and sanctions are imposed, right? Which basically says, okay, we are legalizing your state, and then the prevailing discourse on the U.S. left until recently, right? We have to acknowledge there have been huge shifts in the last 5 years, right? But until then, the prevailing discourse was, yes, like the state is a regime. And it's selectively applied, right? So if you read Middle East social science, there are regimes and there are states. There is, and the more clever ones will be like, oh, nizam, but that's the word we use in Arabic. I'm like, bro, we're not in Lebanon. So,
because of how the Westoid mind is framed around anti-communism, that anti-communism just translated directly into, because it's communist regime, right? That was always the phrase. That's like how the Americans talk. And so like that just translated over into all these, into like, oh, the regime of Zimbabwe, as you point out, the Cuban regime, the Tehran regime. And so it's interesting though, is that the Iranians in the West use regime. Like they use that word basically as like state, and it's like the collapse between these two. It's like the same mess of Iran and Persia, funny enough, Iran and Persian. This like messy overlap between the semantic range of these words and and how your use of those words reflects upon your own location of like what you think is legitimate and what you think is like, oh, illegitimate. And yeah, like the regime liberals who like, that's what I always think of them in my brain. I mean, these people are, like you look at Syria, they've all gone quiet on Syria as the thing they wanted to happen has happened. No one even mentions Libya anymore. I mean, it's crazy.
No one mentions Libya. But it's two things, right? One, they of course never have an account for their crimes. But two, I'm just like, okay, why is the U.S. not a regime? Like the U.S. like locks up protesters, deports people. Right now, just passed something saying that naturalization would only you have to profess anti-communism in order to become naturalized. That was passed like literally yesterday. I'm like, this is just not the U.S. is not a democratic state. Like everyone is scared to cross U.S. borders.
Canadians, okay? Mild-mannered, waspy Canadians are now like afraid of crossing the border. Like this is everything that the US ever said about Iran has always been true about itself and infinitely more. I mean, this is I always say it's like it's like the house of mirrors. Like you're just stuck in a house of mirrors when you're talking about Iran. And you realize that it's like that house is erected by compradors, like a vast class of compradors. But what's interesting is that the uneven development in the US among that class, among different countries, enemy countries. And so there is a much smaller class of Russian compradors who do what Iranian and say before that Cuban compradors used to do when Cuba was more, its own enemy status was more relevant to like US political making. Or in Venezuela, it's less good. But the Iranian one is the most advanced, I would say. The most advanced, most developed comprador class. And the reason why is because Zionists fucking jack them all up with steroids. Like every loony, mouth-frothing loser gets their own channel.
Yeah, I mean, they're very on the back foot these days also, I think, because of once it escalated to war itself, it was very clear that was attacking the regime. That it also attacked lots of civilian infrastructure, of course, right? But it also attacked military assets. And I'm just, does Iran have the right to military assets? I mean, are we actually deciding which portions of self-determination are allotted to the Iranians? This is like literally what they imply, right? And there's this subcurrent. I mean, I remember that Yoshi Furuhashi, you know who that is, right? From former online editor, the super boss, speaks 300 languages fluently. And she knows more about Iran than like anybody on earth. Really, she was pointing out even in 2009 in debates with these kind of these roided up Trotskyites that these kind of like Trotskyites who were on like an amphetamine mixture of like Alex Kalinikos and like Perry Anderson, like Bob Jessup or whatever, and of course that depraved doddering fool, what's his name? Benner? Not Benner.
Robert Brenner.
A very ridiculous figure, really. But I just was like, okay, I'm just going to start insulting people. Forgot my point. She pointed out that she's like, let us start from a very simple premise when discussing Iran and its reaction to these 2009 regime change protests. The state is repression and it's also social reproduction, right? The most simple point in the world, that the state coordinates a wide range of social reproductive functions. And this is critically important, right? So when you talk about demonizing the state, you're actually opening the door to the collapse of, we're against the regime. Where does the regime end and the state begin? Do Iranians have the right also to universities and hospitals and public transport systems? Who runs that? Well, that's the state. The same state, well, IGRC makes it a bit more complicated, but in terms of talking about it, but like the IGRC also runs a lot of economic infrastructure for that matter, right? So can you target the IGRC? And how is that state protected? Here we get into the basic question, which is what is the modality of U.S. imperialism, right? The modality of U.S. imperialism is state collapse in the Arab-Iranian region, is state collapse premised on the incapacity of the military force of the targeted state to defend its social reproductive assets, right? And therefore, the regime, of course, has an internally repressive function, but this is not Brazil in 1968 over here, which of course was US aligned, right? So it's not like a sub-fascist dictatorship that's using its military force to just brutalize all free people, right? It's using its coercive strength to protect the state, to protect all this social infrastructure. And, I wrote that, and some demented Venezuelan Trotskyite went nuts on me and was like, you're a joke. I'm like, what I've written is like not even rising to the level of contention. Like, it's just like basic observable facts about social reality that themselves you are also trying to criminalize. You're trying to actually exercise social sanction about how we discuss basic facts about reality, which is that the state has a protective function. The military has a protective function in a moment when the U.S. is exercising a policy of worldwide state collapse. And such state collapse is in the very nature of the current operations of U.S. imperialism, and therefore anti-symmetric or symmetric military force has a liberatory aspect. It is a progressive, historically progressive force in our moment. If you are denying that, you're a moron.
Yeah, I mean, that's this. There is a simplicity to this argument, which is like there are imperialist forces in this world, and there are forces that fight those forces. You don't get to determine who is the nature and the character, who is worthy of determining. Now, this is a little slightly messier. Like, let's transpose this conversation from Iran and its geopolitical role in that specific West Asian region, and let's talk about Eurasia and Russian Federation. like the Russian Federation and its role in anti-imperialism is, I would say, even a tougher nut to crack than Iran. Iran is a straight up case. Russia, on the other hand, is that you have this messy situation where on the one hand, it is an enemy of the U.S. empire, and the U.S. empire has victimized it for decades and decades since the collapse, which it helped eradicate. Like Russia is a strange example because they got what they wanted in the collapse of the Soviet Union, but be careful what you wish for, because after a 10-year, sure, they endured 10 years of fun. They got to spike the football on the Soviet Union for 10 years. They got to make their movies. They got to make their jokes about how Russia's on our side now. But then this figure, this like Cincinnatus-like figure, like who rises from obscurity, relative obscurity. I mean, he was a figure in what could be called the deep state, but he was just a regular, pretty normal dude. He wasn't a beacon of power. He wasn't comes up from the ranks, reasserts state sovereign control over the vast resource wealth, kicks out a parasitic class, or at least leashes them, depending on the case, of wealthy capitalists who had been looting the country in alignment with Western and Zionist needs. I mean, so then you have on the one hand, like Vladimir Putin and the current configuration of the Russian Federation is a force of anti-imperialism. But then you look at their behavior in the region, which is at best a mixed bag, at best. At times it's like openly baffling. At times it's actually imperialist, right? In the case of Iran, the Soviet Union was an imperialist force, which is why they never had warm relations, right? The Soviet Union actively supported Saddam in his imperialist West-based war against Iran and which was used to bleed the Islamic Republic dry, which ended in this very painful stalemate, essentially stalemate, but it was a victory in the Islamic Republic in a sense because they survived. The point of that kind of battle is to bleed, but also to endure collapse. And the Iranian people were able to survive a much more brutal and longer war than what the Zionists could ever pull off. That's also the matter at all this, is that Iranians' mettle has been tested on the battlefront, which they could never do. The Zionists can't do what they need to do by air and through their little James Bond like fanfare. They can't do that. You can't chip away at a massive mountain. You have to go and blow it up piece by piece, pockmark it, hit it harder and harder. And meanwhile, if you do that, you take casualties, which is what happened. So I think the paradox of all of this is that, like, on the one hand, what you were describing is like the left, the irrelevance of the left, is that here you had this moment of anti-imperialist success. The plan of the Islamic Republic was to get through moments like this because essentially you're on your own. I mean, there were other state actors in all of this, Pakistan, China, Russia. I don't think we know the extent of their rules, respectively.
They're on their own in terms of the direct military confrontation. But if you take China out of the equation, I mean, Iran doesn't see necessarily a short-term collapse at all, but Iran is in a very bad situation without the China, what are they called? The teapot, oil smugglers. The Chinese smuggling rings, also the fact that China has a sovereign technological base. I mean, the Iranian military.
Well, also a direct rail link that overcomes American sea dominance. That's the big thing. And that's also the link they have around that sea dominance to like at least the Indian Ocean. And that's like, to them, and Syria was supposed to do that in the Mediterranean, as we know, and Lebanon was supposed to too, which is why they blew up the port. But yeah, without Iran, China has nothing in terms of energy future. So it is a dance.
China's actually shifting so fast to renewables.
I was just going to say that. I meant to say oil. They like everything they need for oil with oil that like is wrapped up in Iran. Other forms of energy, they have it in the bag. And in fact, they may liberate the region from those other needs with their help, but if only they were allowed to, because we know Americans and their Zionist allies will just destroy everything once you build it up. So this is the difficulty.
Right. I mean, and I think to again take a step back, the failure to conceive of imperialism properly is also a failure to conceive of properly of the contemporary relations between capitalism and imperialism in a post-Soviet moment, right? Like, the U.S. was engaged in a process of kind of prophylactic capitalist development all over the third world. And people love to say when they're talking about the Arab-Iranian region, they're like, it's not the Cold War anymore. You're like, you're right. You're right, buddy. It's not the Cold War anymore. And the counterweight is that now China wants market-based development, more or less, and the US wants state collapse, right? Whereas under the previous period, it was over the nature of the struggle was over the nature of market-based development, right? On a world scale, that the US wanted a capitalist friendly, and the Soviets generally wanted a more state-oriented planning regime, right? And it was over the kind of redistributive aspects of the planning regime itself. That was the battle, because, this is something Anwar Abd al-Malik points out, is that imperialism is always formed in the interaction between the forces of capital and the forces of liberation, right? That's where imperialism as a practice from which the theory is abstracted, that's what imperialism is, right? And so this is something Ali took up, Ali Qadri, in pointing out, okay, there is no more Soviet counterweight. And so what the US is carrying out post-1990, both by economics and politics, is the collapse of social reproduction through war, but also sanctions in the Arab-Iranian region. And so that makes us reinterpret the Iranian role, and it makes us now in 2025, which is crazy, right? I'm like, how old are we, Sina? I don't know. At the IRS yesterday, the dude was like, "You're not 41." He's like, "This is real. You're 51." And I was like, man, like, you're not really allowed to say that. Like, you're a government employee and you're like harassing me about my age. Be that as it may. Right?
To be fair, the guy was right. You are 51. You're in fact like 63 in your soul.
Such crap. I pulled out, he had my ID in front of him. It was outrageous. I'm sure it's illegal for government employees to talk that way. But be that as it may, right? This is then things shifted again with the rise of China, which doesn't want to engineer state collapse, right? Whereas the U.S. does. And okay, like, there's all sorts of criticisms of Chinese foreign policy. I don't really have the energy to delve into that this morning, but the overall problematic is that China has a very different, qualitatively distinct foreign policy from the U.S. and is also at war with the U.S., right? And it also, this is a point that a lot of scholars have brought up, is that, the other thing, you had the fall of the Soviet Union, which probably, Ignatius Sachs, I was already pointing out in like 1960 that this meant that you had an alternative technological pole. That alternative technological pole has taken a qualitative leap in the last 10 or 15 years, right? With the Chinese able to compete with the US in basically every single high-tech field, except for the construction of jumbo jets, right? But otherwise the Chinese are able to offer a technological alternative. A lot of that is going into the Iranian military industrial plant and also the Iranian industrial plant overall. I mean, there's also a lot of circumvention that was going on previously through the UAE, but now the Iranians are actually pretty adept at securing sufficient intermediaries for the parts they need for their supply chains, for their kind of for their various industrial projects, that the sanctions effectiveness is actually really starting to markedly decrease for a country as powerful as Iran, right? This is something we need to keep in mind also. But at the same time, this is also partially, it's because Iran, especially its military base, is very integrated and able to borrow to a large extent from the Russian and Chinese military industrial bases, which are quite advanced, right? So you have different possibilities for the protection of the state in our current.
And it also works the other way, right? With the Shahid drones, which were based upon American designs, and the Iranians gave that to the Russians, and they rebranded them as Jaren 2s or something. So there's a lot more. It's in the case of Russia and China, Iran. There, I don't think. Obviously, we don't have the details to make our assumptions that a lot of us do. I do this myself, honestly. I think about like these things, but then you forget that you are like on the sidelines, and the things that are happening that are of serious consequences that have like rippling effects, you don't see them because we're just, we're just ants in some of this. We're not like up there and connected to these military circles. And the way they demonstrate them is in moments like what happened in June 2025. Is that it turns out that the Israeli enemy was coordinating. And that's why I was like, it's also, there's also like the problem of talking about all this is that we're not talking about rational actors. Is that there's rational and irrational actors, and rational actors use irrationality to their benefit and vice versa, I would say. So like, this is not like, so it's hard because at the root of what we're discussing is intention, right? Because before at the beginning, we were like, what was the goal of the Zionist things? That they had intentions, and those intentions were either, well, I think it's safe to say they were not met. Those like the intentions were to achieve the following things, and those were not achieved, and so they did not meet their intentions, right? Like that's, and so but the problem of like interpreting intentions is that you have to like presume a stable mind on the other end, which is calculating all of these things, which I don't think is in the case in the entity and its American patrons. I think irrationality is the order of the day for these creatures, especially when they're confronting their own sundowning like nature of their empire, which is like, happening every day in front of us. The fact that China is so untouchable for them is a disaster for the US empire. Same with Russia, that they couldn't achieve what they wanted to achieve directly at Russia. So they had to sacrifice Ukraine to even begin to approach what they need to do to weaken the Russian state. But then you have this backlash, you have this sort of backfiring in all these cases, because in the case of China, it only made them double down on creating a interrelated network of trains and rail and sea lanes to circumvent American control and the sort of control of their economy. In the case of Russia, they went and sought and they deepened their own industrial base. They can and expanded their own military industrial production to not just match but overcome the entire Western American like military machine, which is being thrown at them vis-a-vis this like country, not insignificant sized country. And in the meantime, they managed, because they eventually clearly want to control this region, parts of this land in the future sometime. They're not taking the sort of scorched earth approach that the Israelis do in Gaza and everywhere else they go, because Israelis are Israelis and Russians actually have rational thinking underneath their actions. And so, like, I don't think the imperialist plans work out for them in any of these cases. It didn't work out for them in Russia and Ukraine. It's not working out for them in their ethno-state war with Gaza. It's not like there are invisible actors to all this. And you're right, is that we in the anti-imperialist resistoid camp, we have like Hollywood brain disease too, because we think everything is a W. It's one W after another. I had this problem too. I'll admit to this. I thought someone like Hassan Nasrallah was superhuman. I really did. I probably in my being, I probably thought he had this superhuman ability to exist beyond death, to beyond the sort of like, and I was wrong.
Hezbollah took a massive blow, right? Hezbollah took a massive blow. And then parenthetically, people are like, where are the Arabs? I'm like, well, let's name which forces did something and which ones didn't. Like, they didn't open the front sufficiently enough. You can find articles babbling, of course, from Trotskyites and so forth, writing for like the Century Foundation, and being like, it's they were launching pinprick rockets or whatever, and I'm like, they took like 4,000 casualties, right? There's like hundreds of children who are wandering around Beirut blind, and they took a hit. They took a super hard hit out of an ideological commitment to anti-Zionism, right? This is crazy. and this isn't discussed. But to close that parentheses, I mean, I think the U.S. is kind of fighting on the terrain of its comparative advantage, right? And it's losing against the bigger actors, but it is raising smaller strategic obstacles at the same time, right? I mean, we don't know the outcome of the war in Gaza. The human toll is beyond belief. The military toll is still to be determined, right? It's a long-term, may have not been conceived as such. I don't know. We may never know. But it's a long-term war of attrition between two entire societies, right? And the Israelis are imposing the costs on Palestinians, right? But Syria was lost, right? Syria was lost. Iraq was contained, right? It's under military occupation, and there was probably blackmail imposed through that control, and also the control over the oil revenues. We don't know. Hezbollah was basically that was a Zionist advance. That is a battle that was lost, right? That was a huge Zionist and American advance, right? So both sides are taking wins and losses, right? But the overall factor is that in the long term, the U.S. is in an imperial sunset because imperialism rests ultimately on the interplay of applying coercive force that is based on a productive infrastructure that's meant to ensure an imbalance in the overall share of wealth. And that is going to get upset, and already is, by China. That's just what's happening.
It already has. No, it already has. It's done. It's done. Like, we're past that. U.S. empire is dead now. All it has is this genocidal warfare. That's what's so confusing, is that to lose, you can still do what winning looks like.
I mean, I don't know. I'm uneasy with the statement that it's dead because there's a lot of destruction left in it. I mean, what they did to Hezbollah and what they did to Syria can be replicated elsewhere, right? And look at what end. I mean, okay, the Bolivia was just lost. I mean, so the forces, there are objective anti-systemic forces that are counter to U.S. interests on a structural level, of course. And there's major wars that the U.S. has basically lost, like with the Ukraine. But they are still able to convert those losses into medium level. I mean, they're not letting the war hasn't stopped. They're still burning up Russian assets. They're still eliciting, there's still wide-scale European security dependency. Trump sat down the European leadership and was like complimenting their suits and was like, we're going to demand that you start using you're going to break the EU budget constraints, deficit constraints, and you're going to remilitarize on the back of your own taxpayers. So it's actually, the US empire is kind of looting its long-term productive assets, including its, the kind of social democratic remnants that remain in Europe, in order to kind of export the cost of maintaining its militarism on a world scale. So this...
Yeah, not exactly behavior of a stable entity, right? Not exactly like an interest, like this is not, institutionally speaking, the institution of the US empire is broken. Like and they're actually accelerating it. Like they're actually accelerating it by nuking their own universities. Like this is the strange, baffling thing. It's like Iranians 50 years ago said death to America. And like Americans right now are saying, okay, like hold my beer. And they're burning down every last vestige of their own power, it seems. And I think the Holocaust in Gaza is part of that.
I think partially, yes, but also, on this, I think it's helpful to keep in mind a very vulgar and economistic view of the state of things, that is the mentality of the ruling class, which is the stock market, right? A lot of wealth is held privately, and probably that's doing better in terms of its annual returns than the stock market, non-publicly traded wealth, which is very significant. But the stock market as a rough index of the overall well-being of the U.S., primarily U.S. anyway, ruling class, is doing fine, which means that there's a lot of people there who are thinking the situation is to some extent under control and continues to be favorable for the long-term flow of our wealth in the form of forward-looking valuations, right? Now, okay, we know that there's all sorts of irrationalities and hype and self-fulfilling prophecies and bubble-type thinking that enters there. Of course, we're aware of it. It's a very rough proxy, and it has a short-term tendency. Even if it's purported to look long-term, it tends to, the gravity of it is much more short-term because of the array of mechanisms of valuation which contribute to stock market valuation. We know all that, right? But I still think we have to keep a proxy like that in mind, that there's a lot of violence left, and there's a lot of confidence that these, Peter Gowan called this like the global gamble, right? This kind of gamble of militarized accumulation, dollarization, de-development, burning strategic obstacles to the ground as they did in Yugoslavia, right? This is wild, actually, that Verso and New Left Review actually used to have like proper political economy analysis of U.S. imperialism in Yugoslavia. And now, like, if you point out to Tariq Ali that he never mentioned the Syria war, and he just blocks you like a fucking aristocrat. Fuck you, man.
Yeah, I mean, this is because partly what's happened is that you've had this, partly one of the results of 9/11 and the sort of fascination machine of around West Asia, Arab Iranian region, that there has been that they've managed to sort of raise an army of compradors, and that army of compradors have slithered into all kinds of spaces, including so-called leftist spaces. Now, mind you, it didn't take much convincing of these useless trots to continue to be useless trots in the era of like violent imperial expansion that we saw in the 2000s, 2010s, is that this moment of U.S. imperium is quite something else. And I don't think one of the failures of our class of people is to inadequately paint the kind of Guernica, an analytical Guernica image required to understand how all these like national theaters, these national conflicts, or like whatever theaters of war, are all connected to this genocidal war. And its main cluster, it's one of its main nodes of that war, is this fucking Jewish Zionist entity. That like this supremacist ethno-nationalist Zionist entity is like the linchpin of this war-making machine, or one of them at least. Let's say, can you have multiple linchpins? How's that metaphor work? I don't think that works. It's like, because it's like linchpin is the one, it's like a grenade, right? So there can only be one.
I think it's kind of like intrinsic to a linchpin that it is the linchpin.
Yeah. So you can't have multiple ones.
But Sina, what do you mean the failure of our class? Like, I'm in favor of us criticizing ourselves and needing to do better and bullying one another and so forth. But
I do mean it on that front, because I don't think our class of people has connected as well as we could all of these things. Because I think we get stuck into the national question too, because the national framework that like area studies has inculcated in us is like, over there, Latin America's, like over there, West Asia guy, over there, they would call it Middle East, obviously. And so that kind of regionalizing. And also, like, they erased all Marxists except for useless trots. And so who are the ones that typically make these kind of, I mean, all liberals do it too, the fucking Jared Diamonds, but they're imperialists in their hearts. Like,
for sure. I mean, this happened both, right? This is it's a worldwide phenomenon, right? I mean, this is what like Sam Moyle and Paris and Praveen Jha called intellectual structural adjustment, right? That once you've raised the third world traditions of liberation Marxism, then you have a generational breakdown of the transmission of knowledge. And because the movement in the world system comes from the peripheries, both intellectually and politically, right? In many ways, if you raise it to the ground at the theoretical level, you're going to have it's be very hard to reconstitute it, right? And this is why the first world university became, with some exceptions, became so barren, right? And you have people babbling that, in fact, the victory of Palestinians could be a boost for capitalism. What? So when someone says that, I just see a swastika, to be honest. Real talk, to be very frank. Like, I'm just like, okay, that's swastika thought. I see no difference.
Can you imagine how bleak like your worldview has to be to like look at, these guys, these starved fighters of Gaza who like exist or like sometimes find themselves sharing one date a day between them and their like fellow comrade who are trapped in a tunnel somewhere. And like, you see them, the same guy walk up to a tank and put a homemade explosive into the tank and run away successfully. And like, we have a class of people who are on its face kind of interested in liberation and critique and all these things. And yet they see nothing in that. They see nothing liberatory. They can't even look at it. They don't even know where to find it. They don't even see it occurring. I mean, what a sad, pathetic life.
They're going to be like the minimal program, which like is not our program, of like the withdrawal to the armistice lines of 67. That's a victory for capitalism because it's state building without Maoist ideology and power or whatever. I'm like, well, they don't like Maoists, but like, I'm just like, you are demented. But this is where I blame our youth. So we're too old to get blamed because we're seniors. Therefore, we export our blame to the weak. I want our youth to challenge those people, to be honest. Like, I want the undergrads and graduate students to shame those professors.
Well, don't worry. There won't be any more undergrads and undergraduates and graduate students at this rate. University of Chicago is actually they're not taking grad students anymore. This is University of Chicago. I mean, the actual death of these institutions is happening, like the live death of them. Like it's that scene it's that clip from Children of Men about the sound going out of your ear, like that beep, like that's it. It's dying. Like that system is dying. And so in some ways, it's a good thing for people in this world that I'm in. Like, it's good. It's good that those voices that get so much instant hegemony right off the bat because of their affiliation. It's good that that's going, that you can all exist on the same internet as me, and you can like just fight the market. You can just exist in this market because in effect, that intellectual class has enjoyed this kind of builded
and
era.
they hate you. Some of them, there's like a class of people who hate you very differently than they hate me. It's curious. What did they call you? Like the anti-imperialist, like they called you something borderline racist. Like
I forget
that Iranian studies guy from Scandinavia.
Oh, who? I can't remember what he said. Oh, there's a bunch of them. I don't remember.
There's a bunch of them. He called you like a tin pot anti-imperialist Twitter titan or something.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, bro, did that come from a word generator? Anyway, we're going to have to actually wrap up because I have to run into something. But I think that I actually I'm going to do something corny, which is like, we do have now a collective of people working on these issues in the North. So people should plug into that Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. You can add that because honestly, we do need to be collectively thinking about these things better together. Right. And of course, it's all the people who you have on the show all the time. Right. And because what these other people are saying is actually, it just relies on the silence of our side. And that's the core of it, because what they say is so manifestly ridiculous, like the Palestinian national liberation would be good for capitalism or would be exceptionally capitalist because it would lead to the creation of a new arena of accumulation. Like, this is a form of dementia that can be easily displaced by better thought. So yeah, do you have like a last?
No, that's it. No, that's good. Thank you, Max. This was a great conversation. It's always good. It's always good for my brain to have these because the dooming it's very tempting to doom for people because it's hard to see the like brass tacks of all this, which is like this imperialist project is failing in its endeavors to expand. That they can't expand, it tries to expand, and all these fits and bursts, and its ability to convince you that it is victorious is a lot of, and fighting back against that is like, yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot of energy that goes into that. And so you're right. Everybody does have to chip in and pull on this. And yeah, I would say like, yeah, be more provocative with like this class of people who imagine a third way, who claim to be anti-imperialists or claim to be against American imperialism, because who the hell would be in support of it? I mean, lots of people, but yet imagine that the people fighting against them are themselves part of the problem. I mean, this is brain rot and proof of that neoliberalism has cultivated in us this completely apolitical life, sociopathic, not feeling, and this was the goal. And I think this 12-day war woke up a lot of people to the reality. And I haven't heard a thing from my regime change leftist colleagues, let's put it that way. I think they themselves are starting to learn that, wow, my position is horseshit. And the country that, and if it were up to me, we would leave our country defenseless. But of course, they won't be honest and admit that. And of course, the people in Syria who helped contribute to the terrible situation in Syria are still crowing about some fake revolution that they never had because it was paid for them by Western and Qatari and Turkish and American and Zionist forces. But anyways, we're fighting a different battle. Thank you, Max. This was a great conversation. And I'll put a link to that collective. We'll talk soon. I'm going to press.